The day Marcus stood in front of his entire class with nothing in his hands, no project, no poster, no notebook. The laughter started before he even opened his mouth. His teacher shook her head slowly. His classmates whispered. One boy in the back said it loud enough for everyone to hear. He probably couldn't afford the supplies. And he was right. Marcus couldn't. But what none of them knew, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that the boy, standing there empty-handed, would one day walk into rooms where the most powerful people in the world would stop talking just to listen to him. This is Unstoppable Stories. And today, you'll discover how a boy who had nothing taught himself everything, and why the people who laughed at him the hardest ended up understanding him the least. Act 1, The Struggle Zero, 32 for 30. Marcus grew up in a neighborhood where ambition was treated like a luxury item. A 2-bedroom apartment, 5 people, paper-thin walls that let in every argument from next door, a refrigerator that sometimes had food in it, and sometimes didn't. His mother worked double shifts at a laundromat 3 blocks away. His father had left when Marcus was 6, not dramatically, not with a scene. He just stopped coming home one day, and no one talked about it. Marcus was the oldest. That meant he fed his younger sisters before he fed himself. It meant he helped with their homework even when he hadn't finished his own. It meant he learned very early that life wasn't going to slow down and wait for him to be ready. School should have been his escape, and for a while, it was. He loved to read, not because anyone told him to, because books were free at the library and they took him somewhere else. He'd check out 3 at a time, carry them home in a plastic grocery bag, and stay up reading by the light that leaked under his bedroom door from the hallway. He was hungry for knowledge, the way some kids are hungry for attention. But school is not always kind of quiet. Hungry kids. He wore the same shoes 2 years in a row. He ate free lunch and looked straight ahead when the cashier scanned his card. He didn't raise his hand too often because when he did, something about the way he spoke, too precise, too serious, made other kids roll their eyes. Who does he think he is? Nobody. He thought he was nobody. That was the first lie he believed. Act 2. The breaking point, 4:30 to 8 o'clock. By 8th grade, Marcus had built a careful invisibility around himself. He got decent grades, stayed out of trouble, and moved through the hallways like he was trying not to take up too much space. Plan vague but real. Do well enough to get into a good high school. Do well enough there to get a scholarship. And somehow, get out. Then his mother lost one of her jobs. Not because she wasn't good at it. The laundromat closed. No notice. One Monday morning, a padlock on the door and a sign that said closed permanently. That week, the electricity got cut off for 4 days. Marcus did his homework by candlelight, not romantically, desperately. He fell behind. 2 weeks of schoolwork piled into a blur. He missed a major exam. His teacher, a woman he had genuinely respected, pulled him aside and said something he never forgot. She said it without meanness, almost gently, which somehow made it worse. Marcus, I think you need to be realistic about your future. He didn't say anything. He nodded. He walked back to his seat. But inside, something cracked. Not his spirit. Not yet. Something else. A wall he'd been carefully maintaining. The one that said things will work out. Kust, going. That wall developed a fracture. He went home that day and sat on the edge of his bed in that small, cramped apartment. And he asked himself the question that every person at their lowest eventually asks. What's the point? Wult? Ekit. Act 3, the decision 8 o'clock to 10:30, he didn't quit. But he almost did. The thing that stopped him wasn't a mentor. Wasn't a movie. Wasn't a speech. It was a book. Left behind on a library table. Already 2 weeks overdue from whoever had checked it out last. A biography of a man who had grown up with nothing. Failed publicly, been publicly humiliated, and rebuilt himself. Not once, but 3 times. Marcus read the whole thing in one sitting. He didn't walk out of the library feeling inspired in a fuzzy, warm way. He walked out feeling something harder, something closer to anger. Because somewhere in those pages he realized that the story he'd been told about himself. You're from the wrong place. You're wearing the wrong shoes. You're realistic about your future. That story wasn't a fact. It was someone else's opinion, and he was under no obligation to live inside it. He went home and he made a decision, not a dramatic one. There was no music, no moment. He just sat down and wrote 3 words at the top of a crumpled piece of paper, figure 8 out. That was the turning point. Not a scholarship, not a lucky break. A decision made alone in a small room by a boy who had just gotten tired of being told what he couldn't do. Act 4, The Journey, 10:30 to 14:30. What followed wasn't a montage. It was slow. It was hard, and most of it was invisible to everyone around him. Marcus started waking up an hour earlier every day. The apartment was quiet before his sisters got up. He'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of water. They couldn't always afford coffee. And read, study, or write. He became obsessed with understanding how things worked. Not just school subjects, everything. How businesses ran, how people communicated. Why some ideas spread and others died. He found free resources online at the school library. He emailed professors at nearby colleges, just students he found on department pages, and asked him questions. Some ignored him. A few wrote back. He entered a citywide essay competition in 10th grade and didn't place. He entered again in 11th grade. He placed 3rd, not 1st. 3rd. But 3rd meant someone had read his words and decided they mattered. That was enough. He started tutoring other students, quietly, informally, because he needed to earn money, and because teaching something is the fastest way to truly understand it. Word spread. He got a small reputation. Not a glamorous one. Just, that kid is actually really smart. His mother noticed the change. She didn't say much about it. She was too tired to say much about anything. But one night, she left a new notebook on his pillow. The cheap, spiral-bound kind. No note. He filled it in 3 weeks. And this is exactly why stories like these are shared here on Unstoppable Stories. Because transformation doesn't look like what we expect. It doesn't arrive in a flash of lightning. It arrives in 1,000 ordinary mornings where someone who had every reason to stay in bed got up anyway. There were setbacks. Of course there were. He didn't get into his first choice program. He had to reapply, re-strategize, redirect. There were months where the progress felt like it had stalled completely, like he was pushing against a wall that was never going to move. He pushed anyway. Act 5, The Transformation, 14:30 to 17 o'clock. By the time Marcus was 19, something had shifted in the way he carried himself. Not arrogance. Something quieter. A kind of steadiness. He had learned to think clearly under pressure because pressure had been his classroom since he was a child. He had learned to communicate precisely because he'd had to fight to be taken seriously. He had learned patience because he'd had no choice. Results hadn't come fast, so he'd learned to trust the process, even when the process felt endless. The boy who'd stood in front of his class with nothing had become a young man who showed up to every room fully prepared. Not because things had gotten easier, but because he had gotten stronger. People started noticing. A professor who had received one of his cold emails years earlier remembered him and offered a research opportunity. A small organization offered him a part-time role based on his reputation for careful thinking and clear writing. He wasn't the most connected person in any room. He wasn't the one with the right last name or the right neighborhood. But he was consistently, undeniably capable, and eventually, that becomes impossible to ignore. The critics from his childhood. Some of them had stayed in the same place, not by accident. By default, Marcus hadn't escaped his neighborhood by pretending it didn't exist. He carried it with him. He understood people who struggled because he was someone who had struggled. That became its own kind of asset. Act 6. The ultimate success. Las 5 de la tarde. Las 7:30 de la noche. The moment Marcus had dreamed of, though he'd never quite let himself picture it clearly, came on an ordinary Tuesday. It was 24 years old when he presented a project proposal to a board of directors at an organization he deeply respected. He was the youngest person in the room by at least 15 years. He was the only one who had grown up the way he did. He stood up. He spoke clearly. He answered every question without flinching. When it was over, the board chair, a woman who had spent 40 years in her field, said something Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. I've heard a lot of presentations. Yours made me think differently, he called his mother that night. she cried. He pretended he didn't. He thought about the apartment with the paper-thin walls, the refrigerator, the library table, and the overdue book. The crumpled piece of paper with 3 words on it. He thought about his teacher, who had told him to be realistic. He didn't feel angry anymore. He felt grateful, because every hard thing, every rejection, every cold morning, every moment he'd been underestimated had been a lesson he couldn't have paid for. Honesty and reality, 1930 to 2030. Here's what this story isn't. It isn't a guarantee. Marcus worked hard and things aligned, but not perfectly. Not on schedule, and not without cost. Some people work just as hard and face obstacles that take longer to clear. Circumstances matter. Luck plays a role, and the gap between effort and outcome can feel impossibly unfair sometimes. Because sometimes it is. What Marcus's story offers isn't a formula. It's a reminder that the version of you that exists on the other side of your hardest chapter is not fiction. It's not guaranteed, but it is possible. And possibility, real, honest possibility, is worth protecting. Powerful conclusion, 20:30 to 22 o'clock. There's a version of Marcus that never got up from the edge of that bed. There's a version that listened to the teacher, that believed the boy in the back of the class, that decided realistic meant small, and small meant safe, and safe meant staying exactly where he was. That version is a ghost. He doesn't exist, not because Marcus was special, but because Marcus made a choice that anyone can make at any age, in any circumstance. The choice to refuse the story someone else wrote for him. Your situation right now, however hard, however stuck, however far from where you want to be, is not the final word on what you're capable of. It is a chapter. It is not the ending. The struggle you're in right now may be preparing you for something you can't yet see. And that is not a comfort phrase. That is a pattern. In life, in history, in every story worth telling, the people who changed things were almost always the ones who had the most reason to give up, and didn't. This is Unstoppable Stories. Because every great success story begins the same way, when someone, somewhere, decides that this is not where their story ends. Call to action. What part of Marcus's journey hit you the hardest? Have you ever been in a room where someone told you to be realistic, and you knew, somewhere deep down, that they were wrong? Drop it in the comments. We read them, and more importantly, so do the people watching who need to know they're not alone. If this story moved you, subscribe to Unstoppable Stories for more journeys of resilience, courage, and what happens when ordinary people refuse to accept an ordinary fate. We'll see you in the next one.